that this is a human enterprise, and so inevitably it's flawed. And what you try to do is to work with others who share your values and share your vision to try to make things better, understanding that you won't make things perfect. A good example, something I'm very proud of, is healthcare reform in the United States. Now this is, as many of you know, healthcare in the United States, we are unique among advanced countries that we don't have universal health care, that oftentimes there are people who are sick who cannot get care, or they have to go to an emergency room to get care. My hope was that I was able to get 100% of people health care while I was president. We didn't quite achieve that, but we were able to get 20 million people health care who didn't have it before. And certainly I have some regrets that we weren't able to get everyone health care, and obviously some of the progress that we made is now imperiled because there's still a significant debate taking place in the United States. But the point, though, is that for those 20 million people, their lives have been better. And we've set a standard of what's possible that people can then build on. I often say that in politics, or at least what I used to say about the presidency, is I saw myself as a relay runner. I would take the baton and I would run my leg of the race. And then I pass on the baton to someone else. And again, that's part of the reason why I'm so interested in talking to young people here today, because each generation tries to make progress knowing that what we do is not going to be perfect, that it's not going to be solve every problem, and that we're going to have to then pass the baton to somebody behind us. But hopefully we've run our leg of the race effectively, and the world's gotten a little bit better. And certainly that's been true in Germany, that's been true in Europe. When you think about just what's happened in my lifetime, despite all the tragedies that we see every day, the world has never been wealthier, it has never been more healthy, it's never been better educated. Young people today have access to information and opportunities that would be unimaginable when I was born or Angela was born. And if we can sustain that progress, then I feel very optimistic about our futures, but it's ultimately going to depend on the young people who are here today, and my job now is to help them take it the next step.
Sie haben jetzt gesprochen über ein sehr wichtiges innenpolitisches Thema. Was fällt Ihnen ein, wenn Sie sich Ihre Rolle in der internationalen Politik, in der Welt, in diesen 8 Jahren vor Augen führen? Wo haben Sie Regrets, was bedauern Sie? Und wo haben Sie das Gefühl gehabt, ja, heute weiß ich, warum ich das alles tue und warum es gut ist, dass ich diesen Weg gegangen bin und jetzt als Präsident das tun kann, was ich tue.
Well, the Chancellor and I were talking briefly before we came out. I think the international order is at a crossroads. It's an important time in the international community. If you think about what occurred, I was born in 1961, which I know that makes me seem very old to many of you. But in history, that's actually not a very long time. And when I was born, Berlin was divided. The Iron Curtain was up. Apartheid still reigned in South Africa. Dictatorships were the norm in large portions of the world. We had just emerged out of a devastating world war, a Korean war. We were about to enter into a Vietnam war, the United States was. Countries were still emerging from colonialism. And because I think of a set of ideals and principles, rule of law, the dignity of individuals, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, a liberal market-based economy. Because of these principles that in fits and starts, Europe and the United States and other countries joined together to try to promote and spread, we saw incredible progress. And here in Europe, there has never been greater prosperity and greater peace than over the last 3-4 decades. That's an amazing achievement. And I think sometimes young people take it for granted. But I think that what we now have to recognize is that because of globalization and because of technology and the disruptions that have occurred, the inequality that exists between nations and within countries, because of the fact that the internet brings us all closer together, but we're still from different cultures and sometimes feel disoriented by the world shrinking because of things like the refugee crisis, that this order that has been created has to be changed, it has to be updated, it has to be continually renewed, because there's a competing narrative of fear and xenophobia and nationalism and intolerance and anti-democratic trends. And so when I think about my role when I was president, but also now as a citizen of the United States and part of the world community, what I think is most important is that we rally around those values and ideals that are best, and we have to push back against those trends that would violate human rights or that would suppress democracy or that would restrict individual freedoms of conscience and religion. And that is going to be a significant battle that we have to fight. All of us have to be a part of. And it's not always easy because, for example, I look at a place like Syria, where despite our best efforts, and this is something Angela and I worked on a lot, you still have a vicious war taking place. You still have millions of people displaced, hundreds of thousands killed. And it is going to require, I think, everything we can do to recognize that what happens on the other side of the world or in these other countries, whether it's in Africa or Asia or Latin America, that it has an impact on us, and that we're going to have to be invested in trying to help those countries achieve peace and prosperity. And as president, I did not always have the tools that I wanted to affect those kinds of changes, but at least we tried. And part of the goal here is if you try long enough, eventually what President Abraham Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, I think can win out.
Ja. Jetzt möchte ich mich an die Bundeskanzlerin wenden. Einige der Themen, die der Präsident angesprochen hat, werden wir nachher noch mal vertiefen. Ich möchte jetzt noch mal die Bundeskanzlerin fragen. Frau Bundeskanzlerin, das Thema ist ja Demokratie, unsere Veranstaltung heute. Und auch die Frage, was können wir als Christinnen und Christen dazu beitragen? Nun ist es ja so, dass es eben schon angeklungen, dass die Demokratie in vieler Hinsicht bedroht ist. Wir haben bei vielen Menschen ein Gefühl des sich Entfernens von den Grundorientierungen und dem Engagement der Demokratie. Manche Menschen haben das Gefühl, die wichtigsten Probleme werden nicht gelöst. pressing matters are not being addressed properly, and politicians seem powerless in face of these problems. We've talked about the refugee issues, and that Europe has not managed as yet to find a common standing on this political topic. Now, can you understand why people might actually move away from politicians? Why? Because they feel they don't solve the problem.
Glaube ich, dass es in der Tat so ist, dass natürlich,
I do believe that
Barack Obama auch
it's
gesagt
true,
hat,
as Barack Obama just said,
Lösungen selten
there can be very rarely a
Thema
100% satisfactory solution. But let's look at the refugee issue, for example. The first thing that one has to say is that hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of people in Germany feel sympathy, feel empathy, have shown compassion, have shown the readiness to accept and receive refugees and look after them, both as volunteers and also as those who are in a position. So that these months have shown we can do something. We can actually move matters forward, and I think we ought to be grateful for this.
Und dann kommen die nächsten Fragen.
Then obviously other questions come to the fore, but that's life.
Barack Obama hat gesagt, er ist 1961 geboren
said, he was born in 61, the year in which the wall was built.
Ich bin noch 7 Jahre früher geboren worden. Ich kam in die Schule, da wurde die Mauer
7 years earlier. When I actually was enrolled in school, the wall was built. My parents were so shocked because it turned our life upside down. All of a sudden, they no longer were able to visit the grandmother, to pay visits to the aunt. Berlin was a divided city. And again, people were vigilant. They saw to it that those people who were in prison in Bautzen were not forgotten, that their names were not forgotten. Actually, sums were paid to release them from prison. For humanitarian purposes, efforts were made so that people could visit each other. And from decades, people probably made fun of you when you said, I am absolutely convinced that German unity will come about. And it did come about. So let us not think in months, let us think in years' time.
Das hat mein Leben geprägt.
That's what was so determinant in my life. I had already made plans. Once I'm retired, finally I will be able to go to the United States of America. And it happened earlier.
Einfach sagen,
so, what you have to tell yourself is, what I am convinced of, I am trying not to forget. I'm trying to work to make this happen every day, a little bit every day. And sometimes it may go more slowly than we think, but at least I have a very good feeling of doing something that is important, of making a difference. And the sum total of all of those initiatives, of everything that people do, of all of the bits and pieces brings us forward. Sometimes there will be setbacks, as there are in history, but all of that will bring us forward.
Konkretes Beispiel aufgreifen von den Themen, die Sie jetzt genannt haben.
Let me just talk about
ich bekomme im Moment viele Briefe als Bischof von Menschen, die sich engagiert haben, die sich intensiv mit viel Empathie um Flüchtlinge gekümmert haben, die geholfen haben, dass sie integriert werden, dass sie Deutsch lernen können, vielleicht einen Job jetzt kriegen. Und die schreiben mir, mein Schützling, um den ich mich so gekümmert habe, soll abgeschoben werden. Die schreiben mir etwa, wenn es um Afghanistan geht, dass sie in Panik, in großer Sorge und Angst sind, dass ihr Schützling dort Gefahr an Leib und Leben erleidet. Und sie schreiben mir auch dann vor allem, wenn es um Menschen geht, die in ihren jeweiligen Kontexten Heimat gefunden haben, die Jobs haben, wo die Handwerkermeister sagen, ich brauche den. Und die können nicht verstehen, warum die Politik es nicht schafft, Regelungen zu finden, flexible Regelungen zu finden, damit solche Leute bleiben können, die eigentlich alle wollen, dass sie bleiben. And policies to make sure that everybody who wants to stay can stay. Any comment on this?
Also ich glaube, das gehört wirklich zu den sehr,
I
sehr
think that
schwierigen
indeed
Themen.
is one
Das
of
ist überhaupt keine
the
Frage.
most complex and
Auch
complicated
weil wir
issues
es am Anfang, als sehr viele
that
kamen,
are out there, because
nicht
at the beginning
geschafft
we were,
die
when
Verfahren
very
sehr
many
schnell zu
came, we
machen
were
und
not
Menschen sind
able
dann
to
in die
actually speed up
Städte
the
und Gemeinden
processes.
gekommen, andere haben sich
People
sie
came
gekümmert.
to the communities, came to
Und
the
deshalb
cities,
gibt es eine
people
sehr
came to
große
the fore
Sorge,
and
dass
tried to
diejenigen,
help
die
them,
sich jetzt
volunteers tried
integriert
to help
haben,
them.
auch das
So
Land
there's
wieder
the very
verlassen müssen.
great concern now, obviously, that those
Wir haben
people who
Menschen, die
finally
freiwillig
integrated into our
zurückgehen. Ich
society
glaube,
have to
das ist
leave the
Einfachste.
country. There are
Aber wir
people
haben auch
who,
welche,
on a
wo wir
voluntary
dann
basis, go back to where
sagen,
they
ihr
came
müsst
from.
zurück.
That obviously is the
Und
easiest.
jetzt sage ich Ihnen, das
But
gehört zu den
there are also
Themen,
some to
die
whom we have
sind,
to say, you
wenn
have
Sie
to go back.
Bundeskanzlerin
And
sind oder Innenminister,
now I have
vielleicht
to
die
tell you that
schwierigsten.
this is
Auf der einen
among
Seite
those
wissen wir,
very, very
dass
difficult
sehr viele
issues
Menschen aus
that you have to
Afghanistan
deal with
vielleicht
when
noch zu
you're
uns kommen
Chancellor
wollen.
or President,
Und
as the
nur die
case may be.
Hälfte von
Now,
denen wird bei uns
there are so
anerkannt
many people who
als
come from
Flüchtlinge.
Afghanistan and try to seek
Und
refuge
Menschen
here.
fragen
Only
mich,
about half
genauso
of
wie
them
Sie
are
fragen,
granted
warum
asylum according
derjenige,
to our legislation.
warum kann das
And
sein,
now,
wenn wir ein
obviously, they
Rechtsstaat sind,
ask, those
wenn
people
wir ein
ask us, well,
Verfahren
if we
hatten,
have rule of law
wenn
here,
wir dann
if we
Gerichtsverfahren
underwent a
nochmal
procedure,
durchgeführt haben und immer wird
then there was
gesagt,
a legal
nein,
proceeding in a
wir
court of
müssen
law.
hier
And
sagen,
then,
es gibt
unfortunately,
kein
we
Recht
have to
hier zu
tell
bleiben.
you,
Warum
you have no
macht der
right
Rechtsstaat
to
dann
stay.
eine Ausnahme nach der anderen?
Why are
Und
there
müssen wir nicht wirklich
made
denen
exceptions to
helfen,
that rule?
die auch
That is
unsere
what people
Hilfe
ask
wirklich
us.
brauchen?
And should
Und
we
dafür
not
haben
help
wir
those who are in
Hunderttausende.
absolute need
dieses
of our help? And we
Dilemma
have hundreds of thousands of people
hier
out
eine
there as
richtige
well.
Entscheidung zu
That is
treffen.
a dilemma.
Das kann ich für
A
mich
dilemma
nur so
that you
auflösen,
have
dass ich
to
sage, wir müssen jetzt schnell
deal
die
with. And
Entscheidung
I can
treffen.
only deal
Wir
with this
dürfen
in
die Menschen,
such a way that I
die
say
keine
we have to
Erlaubnis
come
haben, hier
to
zu sein, nicht
a
erst
speedy
in die
decision as
Gemeinden
possible. So
schicken
those
und
people
mit
who do not
Ehrenamtlern so
have
viel Arbeit dort investieren
granted
und dann
asylum to stay,
schneller nach
granted the
Hause
right to
schicken.
stay here,
Das ist die bessere
we will have
Variante.
to send them back as quickly as possible and not have them leave in the
Before I give
Ja,
the
ich
floor to
weiß,
Christina,
dass ich mich
one follow-up
damit
question.
nicht beliebt mache.
I know
Ich will aber
it is not an
trotzdem
answer
sagen, dass wir
that will
auch
endear me to many
aufpassen
people, but
müssen, dass
we
wir
have to be
wirklich
very
denen
careful.
helfen,
We have to help
die
those
unsere Hilfe
who
brauchen.
really
Und
need
davon gibt
our
es mehr als
help.
genug
And
auf
there
der
are
Welt.
more than enough on this
Die
world.
schon sehr lange hier sind.
No,
Sie
it's
haben
a
ja
follow-up
gesagt,
question to
Sie
those
haben ja
who
gesagt, dass die
have been here for quite some
Verfahren
time.
früher sehr lange
You said
gedauert
early
haben.
proceedings
Jetzt
took
hat man
so
es ja
long.
geschafft,
Now
dass
we've
die
managed
Verfahren
to
jetzt wirklich auch
cut them down in
rasch und
time. Now we've
schnell
quick
passieren. Könnte man
processes
nicht
in
eine
place.
Regelung
Now
finden?
why
Und
not
das ist doch
find a
vielleicht etwas,
solution,
was die Menschen
which
auch von
might
der
be
Demokratie
ideal, which
erwarten,
is
dass sie
what
das
people
Recht so
expect of
verändert, dass
democracy,
es
to
passt auf
change
die
the
Menschen,
law, to
dass
make
die
it suit
Menschen,
what
die
people
einfach
need,
schon sehr
to
lange
make sure
hier sind, wo die Kinder in der
people
Schule
who've stayed
sind
here for quite some
und die
time,
Deutsch
you know,
sprechen,
whose
dass man
daughters
dafür
and
rechtliche Regelungen
sons
schafft,
already go to
damit
school,
die
to make
einfach
sure
hier
you have a
bleiben
legal
können,
foundation that allows
dass
them
jetzt
to
also
stay
faktisch,
already in Germany.
was faktisch da ist, gelöst werden kann.
Also wir haben ja schon eine ganze Menge von Regelungen
After all,
geschafft.
we've already created quite a lot of rules and
Spielräume
regulations, and there is also a certain amount of leeway for the local authorities. I myself receive letters about these matters all the time, and we've said whoever has started vocational training, professional training, will be allowed to complete this, and will, also then in the aftermath, will be allowed to stay a further 2 years. If he or she has found a job, will also be allowed to stay on. So there were exceptions made. Then there are cases, obviously, expressed in letters that you receive, maybe that we receive, which are difficult. But if we think of 80,000 people coming here to this country, after all, in 2015, 150,000 from Afghanistan, and I believe 1,000
die überhaupt damit konfrontiert wurden, dass sie
have
wieder
actually been
zurück müssen.
confronted
Ich glaube, wir
with
müssen
having
Klarheit
to go
schaffen,
back.
aber die
That shows you the sheer
Zahl hat
dimension.
hier wirklich auch
So
gute
I think the
Integrationschancen,
overwhelming
sollte man
number
auch nicht
has very
vergessen. Und wir
good
versuchen,
chances to get
sachgerechte
integrated,
Lösungen
and
zu
we are
finden.
trying to find good solutions for them.
Even though the question wasn't directed at me, I just want to make one comment about this. Because the United States, although as a consequence of geography and separation from oceans, we haven't seen the same numbers of refugees from Syria or Afghanistan. There obviously has been a significant immigration debate in the United States, people coming from Mexico, more recently coming from Central America and Latin America. And the struggle that I think Angela has, that I've had when I was President of the United States, is that in the eyes of God, a child on the other side of the border is no less worthy of love and compassion than my own child. We can't distinguish between them in terms of their worth and their inherent dignity, and that they're deserving of shelter and love and education and opportunity. But we are also the heads of nation states, and we have responsibilities to citizens and people within our borders, and we have finite resources. And so part of the job, I think, of governments is to express humanity and compassion and solidarity with those in need, but also recognize that we have to operate within legal constraints and institutional constraints and the obligations that we have to the citizens of the countries that we serve. And that's not always easy. One way that we can do a better job, though, is to create more opportunities for people in their home countries. And that's why I think one of the challenges that I've had in the United States, perhaps Angela's had here in Germany, is getting people to understand that when we provide development aid to Africa, or we are involved in conflict resolution in areas where war has been taking place, we make investments to try to deal with climate change and the displacement of farmers and people whose way of life is being changed because weather patterns are changing. Those things we do not just for charity, not just because they're the right thing to do or out of kindness, but also because if there are disruptions in these countries, if there's conflict, if there's bad governance, if there's war, if there's poverty, in this new world that we live in, we can't isolate ourselves. We can't hide behind a wall. And I think it's very important for us to see those investments as part of our own well-being as well as to the benefit of others.
Mr. President, darf ich da nochmal nachhaken auf etwas grundsätzlicher? Sie sagen, in den Augen Gottes sind die Menschen dort wichtig und Mitleid und Mitgefühl. Und es ist wahrscheinlich kein Zufall, dass der Bischof hier auch sehr viel Applaus erhalten hat von den Menschen auf dem Kirchentag, die genauso fühlen. Da muss man doch helfen, die müssen doch bleiben können. Und Kirchentag ist eine Veranstaltung von Christinnen und Christen, die sich
by
genau
Protestants
dafür
who
einsetzen
really
in
make
der
the case for
Politik.
this very topic, to make sure this finds its place in politics. Now, religion in public sector has enjoyed a rise in both negative and positive ways. Maybe this bears a threat in the US in particular, that there might be too many religious arguments in political debates. Is there something like too much faith which can't actually be put in place? Does it clash?
Oh, look, the United States is a very religious country, and I think that's been a great source of strength. But part of the reason historically that we've been such a vibrant faith community is because there's been a separation between the state and the church. And that, by the way, was viewed as a protection of communities of faith, that they would be able to practice their religion freely. And it has served us well, I believe. I think that the issue is not whether there's too much religious motivation in people going into public service or being part of government. I think the danger is when we fail to recognize that in a democracy, there are going to be people of many different faiths. And that in democracy, compromise is something that's required. When we talk about our own religious faith, by definition, there are certain things we don't compromise. And I think where we get confused sometimes is bringing the same unwillingness to compromise that we may express in our own faith into the political process. Because the truth is that in the United States, we're a predominantly Christian nation, but we are also a Muslim nation and a Hindu nation and a Jewish nation and a nation that has a lot of non-believers. But what we can find is ethical and moral principles that bridge us together. And when we focus on those things, then we can make progress. Even if in our own families, our own faith communities, our own religious practice, there are certain things that we're not going to agree with. And that, I think, is where we sometimes get confused. I will say personally for me, in my own faith, I also think that it's useful to have a little bit of doubt. Faith is... The reason you need faith is because you're believing in things that you can't see right away. And as a consequence, I'm always humble. I try to be humble when it comes to my faith. I don't assume that God is speaking exclusively through me. I assume that God sees wisdom in all the people out here too. And if I become so convinced that I'm always right, that it does not admit the possibility that maybe someone else has some wisdom and is expressing God's will, then the logical conclusion of that ends up oftentimes being great cruelty and great violence. And I think that in a pluralistic world, in a world in which we have many different peoples coming from many different faith traditions, trying to preserve some sense that each of us only sees part of the truth, not the whole truth, is an important quality to have.
Werde Ihnen, Frau Merkel, Frau Bundeskanzlerin, gleich die gleiche Frage stellen.
Chancellor Merkel,
500 Jahre Reformation für die Reformatoren war schon klar, dass Beruf und Alltag auch Gottesdienst sind und geprägt sein sollen von den christlichen Werten. Wie sehen Sie in Deutschland das Engagement von Christen im politischen Bereich?
Naja, um das anders anzuschließen, was Barack Obama eben gesagt hat, möchte ich für mich auch noch mal sagen, der christliche Glaube ist ja erst einmal
Barack Obama already said,
der für mich
taking a leaf of his
bedeutet,
book, I would say my faith, my personal faith means for me personally, there is something
in mir,
above
das mich als ein Geschöpf
me, but also
verstehe,
something
Gottes,
within me that makes me understand to be something that God has created, an individual that God has created, but my abilities are finite. That is to say, I am called upon to act in full accordance with my conscience, inspired by my Christian faith. But I also have the right to make mistakes. Well, maybe not the right, but I know I am aware of the fact that I'm bound to make mistakes, which doesn't crush me completely. I'm not devastated through this, but I am also held, if you like, by God, and it gives me a little bit of humility, but it also makes it incumbent upon me not to stop trying. And this humility that I feel also makes it incumbent upon me to look upon others and their strengths. We are called upon to be free Christians, but my freedom is limited by the freedom of others, and that in a way inspires me. That's the way I view a society. It shows in what I do politically and what others do politically. Now, Barack Obama has said the United States of America are not only made up of Christians, and that's true for Germany too. We are a country with a deep imprint of the Christian faith, but also of the Jewish faith, and there are a lot of Muslims also living within our societies. And what you must not do as a Christian, obviously, is feel you're so superior that there are different values that you attach to different faiths and therefore to different people and individuals. The article of our basic law, the dignity of man is indivisible and inviolable.
Richtig.
Sorry, inviolable.
So, und
but both, I think, both tenets are true.
Deshalb ist es im täglichen Leben einfach.
In people's daily
lives. Was gewonnen
ist
aus dem christlichen Glauben ist, dass ich mich einsetzen muss für die Würde der Menschen
has to be shown in such a way that you stand up for the dignity of the individual, and it is a good thing if there is a common inspiration and a common view of how you should pursue your life. It is certainly more difficult to live in a diaspora than living among so many who share your Christian faith. That gives me strength in addition.
Von beiden habe ich jetzt gehört.
Now I've heard from both of you that Christian belief and faith
für die Umsetzung in einer pluralistischen Demokratie ist das Bekenntnis zum Grundgesetz und
is also abiding by basic law, and also to agree that you don't hold 100% of wisdom. Do you think this is the essential of a democracy, which is also in accordance with faith?
Der Präsident. Also ich würde sagen,
I'm supposed to answer, or the president, or I would say, yeah, I would agree, yeah, to a fairly large extent. That's my view too.
Look, I think the challenge that we all face, and there's no perfect answer for this, we discover it through our actions and reflection, is, as Angela said, we're motivated by our faith, our conscience, the values and ideals that are most important to us. We should be willing to risk something for them. We should be willing to challenge conventional wisdom. If you think about the United States, it was people of faith who were the first ones to speak out against slavery. And it required a sense of righteous anger against an institution that for many they viewed as just the natural order of things. It was a radical movement initially that eventually elevated people's consciousnesses and led to that long march towards freedom. So we have to act based on what we believe is true and is right. My only suggestion is that when we do so, it is important for us also to remind ourselves that God does not speak to us alone. That if the actions we're taking appear to violate the freedoms, the dignity, a sense of mutual respect with others, if we fail to listen to people who disagree with us, if our faith is so weak that we can't have it challenged and we shut people off or lash out against them because somehow they don't agree exactly with what we agree with, then to some degree our faith isn't very strong. For me, the strength of your faith is that you can engage with people who have different views, and you can treat them with respect, and you can listen to them, and you can have a good argument, and then still find ways to live together and work together. And hopefully, if your faith is strong enough and your ideas are strong enough, and they meet the test of time, then ultimately, I believe in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. Sometimes it takes, as Angela said, a long time to get there. And the most important thing the faith provides is maybe persistence and a willingness to continue even when it's hard.
Darf ich es an einer Stelle nochmal vertiefen und nochmal konkret machen? Denn das beschäftigt mich, beschäftigt uns, glaube ich, alle. Sie haben in Ihrer Autobiografie, The Audacity of Hope, auch selbst mal Bezug genommen auf eine bestimmte Bibelstelle, die extrem herausfordernd ist. Da geht es darum, dass wir den Hungrigen zu essen geben, die Nackten kleiden, die Durstigen zu trinken geben. Matthäus 25, das Gleichnis vom Weltgericht. Und Christus sagt am Ende, was ihr dem geringsten meiner Brüder, der ergänzten Schwestern getan habt, das habt ihr mir getan. Christus selber identifiziert sich mit den Menschen, die nichts zu essen haben. Jetzt möchte ich einfach mal fragen, wenn ich jetzt den jedenfalls lange Zeit mächtigsten Mann der Welt neben mir sitzen habe. In dieser Zeit haben die USA... Ja, klar. Es dauert immer einen Moment, bis die Übersetzung angeht.
Nein, ich habe so geguckt, weil neben ihm
I was looking this way because after all I sit next to you first and foremost.
Das Neben war jetzt etwas inklusiver gemeint, als Sie es verstanden haben.
It was a bit more inclusive than you thought it was.
Ich setze trotzdem noch mal an.
Still though, let me ask again.
Also 2 Plätze neben mir.
I mean, okay, so 2 seats from where I sit, next to me.
Der ein Land geführt hat, das ein Militäretat von 600 Milliarden Dollar hat.
$600 million military budget.
Und das ist jetzt eine sehr moralische
Frage. This is a very moral-driven question, but we still have to face it and ask it. At the same time, every day, 24,000 people die simply because there's not enough food or medication. Though it's actually there in the world, it does exist. So there's a tension, there's a gap. And we got to ask and talk about it, how to deal with this tension. And you see, I'm really interested to understand what your viewpoint is, because you, as someone who actually quoted this Bible quote of this text, how you deal with this contradiction and where you see the future, how we can agree a world where everybody lives in dignity.
Well, that's a big question. How much time do we have?
I know.
Let me divide the question into 2 parts. I think that one of the major questions that this generation and future generations will have to face is the growing gap in opportunity and increasing inequality that we're seeing between nations and within nations. The amounts of wealth and opportunity and consumption that exists at the very top relative to the enormous need that still exists around the world is something that, in my view, is unconscionable. And there is enough to feed everyone. There is enough to shelter everyone and clothe everyone and educate everyone if we are able to design a social compact that reflects our best values. Now, that's not easy to do. I think that it's not simply a matter of writing a check and sending money, because part of the goal has to be to create societies that are self-sufficient and have self-determination and dignity. And this is why when I looked at how we could budget our development and our aid programs, we were constantly focused on not simply how do you give a fish, but how do you teach people to fish. And also, by the way, how do you make sure that governments are promoting the interests of the people from the bottom up as opposed to just folks at the top. And I think we should take a moment to reflect on the enormous progress that has been made, even in my lifetime. There have been hundreds of millions of people who have been lifted out of extreme poverty just over the last several decades. Hundreds of millions of people. China, in India, in parts of Africa that are some of the fastest growing in the world. We always focus on what still needs to be done, but sometimes in order to motivate ourselves, we have to look back and see the good things that have been accomplished and have been achieved. So that's point number 1. The second point is with respect to military budgets. Look, would I love to see, for example, the ultimate elimination of nuclear weapons from this planet? Absolutely. I spoke about that in Prague my first year as president. And in some cases, we were able to reduce some of the reliance on both our and Russia's nuclear arsenals. But in the same way that it takes time for us to move to a point where we are lifting people out of poverty, it's going to require us to apply steady effort to reduce the need for military budgets. And the truth is, we do live in a dangerous world. We live in a world in which the United States oftentimes is called upon to put pieces back together again when nobody else has the capacity. And I saw that firsthand. You think about the Ebola crisis in Africa, where essentially it was the United States government and our military that had to go in and build the infrastructure that allowed relief efforts to get in, doctors, medicine, evacuations to get in, to solve a crisis that could have killed hundreds of thousands of people. And there are going to be times where, without that kind of military effort, bad things happen. What I do think is that the more we can emphasize diplomacy and development alongside our military over time, the less reliant we are primarily on our military to achieve the goals that we all have. And that means seeing that all as part of our national security budget. The national security budget shouldn't just be seen as military hardware, but it should be seen as development, and it should be seen as
I actually only wanted to remind you of the fact that Barack Obama, in a world where you had many military conflicts, gave a speech at the time in Prague. A world without nuclear powers is what we ought to strive for, and we should not forget those goals that may seem improbable at this point in time, but that are still out there. Disarmament has to remain at the very top of the agenda, no question about it. On the other hand, I, for example, was very grateful when we saw what happened to the Yazidi minority in Iraq, when the intention was clearly to wipe them off the face of the earth, that at the time the Kurds, with the help of the United States of America, were actually able to step in militarily, to do drops of goods that helped those people to survive, and to also fight against ISIS. And we here in the Grand Coalition then said, can we actually sit on the fence and just watch it and be happy that we have the United States and not do anything? We're not doing the lion's share in that particular fight now, but we're doing something. And actually, at the time, I was in a situation where I was wholeheartedly behind this decision. I was grateful that there are military possibilities that enabled us to avoid a situation where this ethnic minority could be wiped out, but this in it of itself is not sufficient. Civil engagement has to come in as well.
So, is it okay to be on the fence, or what can we do if we observe, and what else should we do? I mean, this is not the end of the talk, but we will have a little break and then welcome the young people that will join us later on. Thank you so much for this talk.
Hallo, guten Tag. Hi again. Thank you. Ach so.
Give them the chairs already? Do we stay in our same seat?
You stay there and we go on the outside. All right, sit down.
Stürzen sich. are asking the question. Yes, Martin, you are asking the question.
Ich bin sehr gespannt.
Ja?
Und so freue ich mich jetzt sehr, dass wir auf der Bühne
so
4 Jugendliche begrüßen dürfen, die
young
Bundeskanzlerin Merkel und Präsident Obama
Chancellor
ihre
Merkel
Fragen
and President
stellen.
Obama are now
Die 4
getting
Jugendlichen
some
nehmen teil
questions.
an einem
The 4 people are
Austauschprogramm
part of
zwischen
an
der
exchange
Trinity
program between
United
the Trinity
Church
United Church
of Christ in
Chicago
und der
on the one and the
Konkordiengemeinde in
Concordian
Mannheim.
community in Mannheim on the other hand.
Sie haben gemeinsam dort ein
Now
Musical einstudiert und entwickelt,
practicing
in dem es
a
um den
musical
Kampf mit Vorurteilen
commonly,
geht, auch
and it's,
Vorurteile mit Rasse und Hautfarbe zu
about
tun hat,
prejudice,
und die Überwindung
stereotypes
von
about race
schwierigen
and skin color,
Herkunftsbedingungen. Und so
and the
vorbereitet
adverse
sitzen Sie
situations
jetzt
of living
hier und
conditions. And
stellen
now
Ihre
you are well
Fragen.
prepared and you have questions you'd like to ask.
Ja, ich begrüße zuerst mal
Well, first of all, I'd like
Phyllis
to welcome
Marleen
Phyllis Marleen Kuyucu.
Sie ist eine Sozialarbeiterin
social
aus
worker
Mannheim, 25
in
Jahre
Mannheim,
alt.
25 years
Sie hat
old.
Sozialarbeit
She
studiert
studied
und
social
hat jetzt
work,
sozusagen ihren ersten
and
Job
this is-
in Mannheim
She
und
just started
ist
her
in der
first job in Mannheim,
Flüchtlingsberatung
and she
tätig.
offers counsel and advice for refugees.
Die erste Frage.
Now, your first question.
So, meine Frage bezieht sich
Now,
auf
my
das Massensterben im
question is
Mittelmeer.
about
Wie bereits
the many
erwähnt,
people who die
arbeite ich
in the
seit
Mediterranean
längerem
Sea.
in der
Now, you know that
Flüchtlingsarbeit,
I've been
unter anderem
working
in
in
einer
the refugee work for quite some
Landeserstaufnahme für
time.
Flüchtlinge.
Now, we have
Und dort
the first
kommen
point
immer
of
wieder
arrival when
sehr
many
viele
refugees arrive.
Bootsflüchtlinge an.
Many people
Mein persönlicher Eindruck ist, dass wir uns
cross
an das
the
Sterben
Mediterranean Sea
gewöhnt
by boat.
haben.
Now, we
Es ist zum Alltag
are so
geworden.
blasé about that people
Mir ist
die.
bewusst,
It's
dass die
become
Politik
an element
mit
of every
verschiedenen
day. Now,
Herkunftsländern an Lösungen
politicians
arbeitet.
are in a
Dennoch
joint
finde ich
effort to
es
solve the crisis,
unverantwortlich,
though I
so
think
viele
it's
Menschen auf
irresponsible
dem
to
Mittelmeer
witness how
sterben
many
zu
people
lassen.
die. So many people
Daher ist
die
meine
on the
Frage,
Mediterranean Sea. So my
was
question
können
would
Sie
be,
jetzt tun,
what can you
damit
do right
jetzt
now
weniger Menschen
to make sure
sterben?
that now fewer people die?
Ja, vielleicht von meiner Seite,
Well,
es ist eine
I would say
Katastrophe.
that it is clearly a
Und
catastrophe.
wir haben deshalb ja
And
wieder eine militärische Mission, die
this is
Mission
why
Sophia, die
we
erst
have
einmal
launched a military operation,
versucht, Menschenleben zu retten. Deutsche Soldaten
Sophia,
haben
Mission Sophia, that is
20.000
first of all
Menschen
trying to
bereits
rescue
im
lives.
Mittelmeer gerettet in den
20,000 people have already
letzten Jahren
been
und so haben es
saved
viele
over the
andere
past
Nationen
few
auch
years by
Aber
German
natürlich
soldiers,
reicht
but
das
also
nicht,
by
sondern
members of
wir
other
müssen den
members of
Schleppern und
the armed
Schleusern
forces
den
of other
Kampf
countries.
ansagen.
That
Das
is
sind
not sufficient. We
Menschenhändler.
have to fight
Das sind
the business
mafiotische
model of the
Strukturen, die auf
traffickers. These
Kosten
are
von Menschen
mafia organizations
und
that
deren Leben arbeiten. Deshalb
work
habe ich,
to the
als
detriment
wir
of
diese
these
Situation in der
people and
Ägäis hatten,
exploit
wo auch
the
Hunderte
situation when we had the
umgekommen sind.
situation
Ja,
in
das
the
Abkommen,
Aegean Sea
sehr
where
für das
hundreds of
Abkommen mit
people,
der Türkei
hundreds of thousands of
eingesetzt.
people perished. I was
Weil wir da
very
sagen,
much
wir
for
helfen der
an
Türkei,
agreement
Flüchtlinge
between the European
dort
Union
besser
and
zu
Turkey,
versorgen.
because I said we have to step in
Wir
and help Turkey
nehmen
to
Flüchtlinge auch auf, aber
look after
kontrollieren
refugees
zwischen
there.
Staaten.
We are also receiving refugees,
wir
but in a
legen den
controlled
Schleppern
way,
das Handwerk.
according to a distribution level,
Viele haben
key
das kritisiert
among
und haben
different
gesagt, wie kann man ein
countries,
solches Abkommen
and this way we destroy
Aber
this
wir haben
business
es
model.
auch
Many
um
have
der
criticized
Flüchtlinge
this and
willen
have said,
geschlossen,
how
denn
can
dort
you
sind Monat
conclude
für
such an
Monat
agreement?
200
But we did it
Menschen
for the sake of the
umgekommen.
refugees,
Im
because month by month
Jetzt ist die
peoples
Aufgabe,
were dying,
in Libyen
and in the
erst einmal
Mediterranean
einen
Sea
Staat
even more people
zu
are dying.
erzeugen, sozusagen,
Now,
also
what we
eine
have to
staatliche Struktur.
see to is that we
Libyen ist
try
das
and
Land,
help
in dem es
establish a state
Flüchtlingslager
structure
gibt,
within
an die
Libya.
kommt
Libya is the
keine
country where you have
UN-Organisation
refugee
heran.
camps
Und
where
erst
no
wenn wir dort
UN
wieder
agency
staatliche
has
Strukturen
any
haben, also
access
Menschen, mit denen wir
whatsoever.
sprechen
And
können,
only once we have a
dann
state
werden wir
structure there,
überhaupt
that is
den
to say
Menschen aus
counterparts that
Afrika,
we
die
can
dort im
talk to,
Libyen sitzen,
will we be able
Hunderttausende
to
ein
help
vernünftiges
those
Leben
people
geben können
who
und dann
are there in
kontrolliert
Africa
über diese
and give them a
Migration
decent
sprechen.
life
Alles
and talk
andere
about
geht nicht.
possibilities
Und
to
diese Aufgabe, in
control
Libyen
this
einen Staat
kind of
herzustellen,
migratory
erfordert
flow.
unsere ganze Kraft.
And
Sie
trying
dauert
to
viel
establish
länger,
state
als wir uns
structures
das
in Libya
erhofft haben.
requires
Aber
a
man
lot of
muss,
strength,
ich
a lot
muss
of
jedenfalls,
political
so fühle ich es,
clout,
jeden Tag dafür
and
arbeiten.
I have to work for this every day, and others do so too.
So we answer the same question? Yeah. Well, look, the tragedies that have been taking place in a place like Syria are ones that have haunted me since we first started seeing the civil war break up. The situation in Afghanistan has been a contributor to the refugee crisis, in part because this is an extraordinarily poor country that's now been at war for over 30 years. we're not going to eliminate all the suffering overnight. The goal has to be a steady move towards a better situation in those countries, even as we save those who we can. And as Angela pointed out, some of the crisis that's happened with refugees is promoted because but I if we can reduce the conflicts that causes these crises in the first place, then that is the most effective way for us to save lives. And within Syria and the Middle East more broadly, trying to bridge the divides that currently exist between Shia and Sunni. We were talking earlier about the nature of religious faith. Here's an example where within a religion, you have seen an unleashing of animosities that didn't necessarily exist historically, but that have been used on occasion cynically by leaders to promote their own interests. Trying to solve those underlying conflicts are the most important things that we're going to be able to do. And we should be honest with ourselves that the young people in those countries and the leaders in those countries themselves are going to have to do the work as well. This is not simply something that we from the outside alone can solve. It's going to be a partnership where countries like Germany or the United States are making every effort to provide assistance and to promote reconciliation, but those countries themselves and the people there have to recognize that the kind of killing that's been taking place and the sectarian conflicts that have been taking place are producing misery on all sides. And we should also remind ourselves that this is not unique, by the way, to the Middle East or Islam, because on this continent, within the Christian religion, there was a whole lot of conflict for a very long time as well. This is part of our original sin, it appears, and part of our job, I think, is to promote a sense of empathy and solidarity and reconciliation, and that begins with each of us.
Sierra Sims kommt aus Dalton, Illinois, einer Vorstadt von Chicago. Sie unterrichtet 12- und 13-Jährige in Gesellschaftskunde und sie ist die erste, die hier einen spezifisch afroamerikanischen Lehrplan eingeführt hat in diesem Fach. Und sie hat schon als Kind davon geträumt, Lehrerin zu werden und heute ermutigt sie ihre Schülerinnen und Schüler, ihre Ziele und Träume zu verfolgen. It's great to have you here.
To follow her dreams. It's great to have you here.
So teaching students in the 7th and 8th grade on the south side of Chicago, I've come to realize the importance of having quality, accessible education for all students. And I've also come to realize that that education has a lot to do with the kind of citizens that our students grow up to be. So my question is, what action items would you give to both students and teachers to first help to bridge the achievement gap, but second, to provide more opportunities for participatory citizenship, both locally and abroad?
Well, first of all, I'm proud of you teaching.
Thank you.
I can't think of a more important job than teaching, and sometimes teachers don't get enough credit, they're not paid enough money, they're not given enough respect, but the contributions that teachers make in opening the worlds of young minds is remarkable. So keep at it. Don't get discouraged. Obviously, the education systems in Germany are different than the United States. I can speak best about what's happened in the United States. We have outstanding schools and outstanding teachers, and we have amazing universities that are world-renowned. But what is true is that in communities like the south side of Chicago, in rural communities and inner city communities, oftentimes the schools are underfinanced. The students, because they're poor and are coming out of homes where there's not necessarily a lot of educational background, need extra help, and they're not getting that extra help. And so as a consequence, what you've seen is that very rapidly some young people are lost in the education system, even as others do very well. And that's the achievement gap that was just mentioned. The good news is we know how to close that gap. If you invest in early childhood education to make up for some of the disadvantages that poor kids have early on in life, they immediately respond and they start doing better. If you invest in smaller class sizes and more personalized attention, then poor children can catch up. If you create an environment in which you set high standards and high expectations, and young teachers are given mentors who are working with the younger teachers to find the most creative ways to inspire students and get them excited, that makes a difference. So we know what to do. The problem in the United States, at least, has typically been the lack of political will. Because I think wealthy parents and communities oftentimes feel as if our kids are doing okay, it's not our problem if other children are not doing okay. And one of the things that I've consistently said is that no country will be successful if it leaves half of its children, or a third of its children, or a quarter of its children uneducated and on the sidelines. And we have to think of them as all of our children, because if Malia and Sasha are doing well, but the majority of their peers are not, ultimately that's going to affect their lives in some damaging way, because kids who don't have opportunity are more prone to get into trouble with the law, more prone to get involved with criminal activity, more prone to be vulnerable to extremist ideologies. They're not contributing to the tax base. The quality of life for everybody begins to decline. And so the good news is we know what to do. The bad news is that we haven't convinced everybody of the necessity of going ahead and doing it. And that's going to take some work.
Auch wir, obwohl unsere Bildungssysteme sich sicherlich sehr unterscheiden,
it's certainly true that our educational systems vary greatly, but we in Germany too have some catching up to do. We also have families where the children, where the parents don't have a work, are on the dole, and where there is a danger that this continues through the generations. We now have a legal claim to getting child care, also for children below the age of 3. It's not an ideal situation. We need to have more kindergarten teachers. We need to have more places, but particularly those who perhaps back home don't get that sort of an interest in education by their parents have to be in such a kindergarten situation so as to do some catching up. But Barry, it's true, we have to also try and convince those who do not see matters in quite the same way, who have enough money, who have enough, who have a job, who have enough abilities and capacities and skills. We have to convince them that they can only live well in a good and sound society, in a healthy society, if each and everyone is doing well. And that's something that we have to invest in and that people have to understand better.
Benedikt
Next question by Benedikt Wichtelhuber. Benedikt
ist
Wichtelhuber
21 Jahre alt, studiert Computer Science an der Universität Mannheim, engagiert sich im Studentenparlament, in der Studentenvertretung, und er wird in Illinois studieren an der Northeastern University in Chicago und hat jetzt die nächste Frage.
And he's got the next question for you.
Mich beschäftigt der Einsatz von Drohnen im Krieg.
Drones and war, I'm concerned about
In Ihrer Amtszeit, Herr Präsident, Frau Bundeskanzlerin, hat diese Technologie einen neuen Aufschwung bekommen.
Chancellor Merkel, this
Zwischen 2009 und 2015 starben ca. 2600 Terroristen durch Drohnen. Gleichzeitig starben aber auch bis zu 116 Zivilisten. Manche Quellen sprechen sogar von bis zu 900 Toten. Wie gehen Sie als Mensch und Friedensnobelpreisträger mit diesen ungewollten Opfern um?
How do you deal with these kind of statistics?
Well, one of the biggest challenges as President of the United States, what I think is true for the Chancellor of Germany or the leader of many of these countries, is how do you protect your country and your citizens from the kinds of things that we just saw in Manchester, England just a few days ago, or the things that we saw in Berlin or in Paris or in Nice? And how do you do it in a way that is consistent with your values and your ideals? Because if we degrade ourselves by thinking in the same savage ways with disregard for human life as those who we fight, then we've lost a piece of ourselves. And that's not always easy, because the nature of the battle against terrorist ideologies and extremist ideologies is not a state against a state. You have individuals who are living in communities. You have people operating in the shadows. And so what I try to do throughout my presidency is create a legal structure and an architecture that would be consistent with our values, with the law, with our principles, with our humanity, but was also firm in terms of defeating those who would kill innocent people. And in some cases, I know for a fact that actions that I took might have resulted in civilian casualties, oftentimes as a consequence of error. But what I will also say is that we were able to put in place a system where there were safeguards in when we went after a terrorist organization, that there had to be near certainty in terms of what the target was, that there was not another option in terms of capturing them, that there was not a danger of civilian casualties involved. And those systems that were put in place resulted in very significant reductions in the kinds of tragic civilian casualties that we saw early on in this process. The one thing that I would say for those who are concerned about this issue is that when you look at drones versus other ways of fighting, it actually typically results in fewer civilian casualties and tends to be more precise in targeting than the average launching of a Tomahawk missile from a ship or the launching of a missile from a plane. So the drones themselves are not per se the problem. The problem is war, which is always tragic, always messy, and I think the danger of drones is not that they are inherently more violent than other weapons. What is dangerous about drones is that because you can be removed from the theater of war, leaders can become complacent, and they can start thinking that this is something that's happening like a video game, as opposed to it involving real people on the ground. And that's something that within my administration I consistently try to fight against, to remind us that no matter how worthy our cause, that we have to do things in ways that do not degrade our own humanity. And that means recognizing that even when we're justified in taking a kinetic action and taking a shot at a terrorist organization, that this is still something that we have to carry with us. I would caution, though, people who are critics to remember, though, these are groups that would be willing to explode a bomb in this audience right now. And we shouldn't be too complacent in recognizing the need to fight against them. Hopefully, over time, it's a battle of ideas and not just a battle of weapons, so that we convince fewer and fewer younger people to get involved with organizations like ISIS. But as long as they're functioning out there, we are going to have to protect our people. I'd want to protect you and your classmates and my daughter and people around the world from sense. Let's make sure we do it in a way that does not encourage more violence over the long term.
Wir stehen wirklich vor der Aufgabe, dass wir es mit Gegnern zu tun haben, die unsere ganze Art zu leben zerstören wollen. Und dass das, was im Kalten Krieg funktioniert hat, das Abschreckung schlimm genug, aber im Grunde manchen Krieg verhindert hat, weil beide Seiten am Leben gehangen haben. Das haben wir bei den terroristischen Gruppen nicht. Die sind bereit, ihr eigenes Leben zu opfern, um das Leben anderer zu zerstören, wie wir es jetzt in Manchester gesehen haben, mit jungen Leuten, mit Familien, mit ganz normalen Menschen. Und was wir, auch wenn es neue Möglichkeiten gibt, wie die Drohnen, trotzdem nicht vergessen dürfen. Krieg, militärische Auseinandersetzung muss immer das letzte Mittel sein. Alles andere muss vorher versucht werden. Und Krieg bleibt immer Krieg. Und ich glaube, die Gefahr, die Sie auch sehen, ist, wenn es plötzlich so anonymisiert wird es dann vielleicht verantwortungslos genutzt. Und deshalb sind die Werte, die uns leiten, wie Barack Obama auch gesagt hat, natürlich umso wichtiger, dass nicht irgendjemand da was entscheiden kann, weil es ja keiner sieht von manchen, sondern dass noch einmal mehr aufgepasst werden muss und nochmal eine neue Institution eingezogen werden muss und diskutiert werden muss. Ist das notwendig? Ist das verantwortbar? Was kann ich, wie kann ich das rechtfertigen? Und das ist, glaube ich, ganz, ganz wichtig. Das heißt, egal wie die technische Möglichkeit ist, unsere Werte, nach denen wir auch schwierigste Entscheidungen treffen und gegen andere Menschen vorzugehen, ist immer eine schwierige Entscheidung. Die müssen uns weiter und vielleicht noch mehr leiten als früher.
We have to be even more vigilant and more guided by our values, maybe that, and arguably than earlier on.
Die letzte Frage kommt von Imani Abernathy aus Chicago. Sie ist eine Sängerin und eine Musikerin. Sie ist überzeugt davon, dass man, um eine gute Bürgerin zu sein, wissen muss, was in der Welt vor sich geht. Und dann versucht, selbst einen Beitrag zu leisten. Und das heißt, mache einen Unterschied, wo auch immer. Das macht sie auch hier. We are happy to have you here.
Doing. We are so happy to have you here.
So, as you heard, I am an artist, and I am involved with arts every day. And one thing that I've noticed is that artists have not found a balance between being an artist and being an activist. And I feel that that is very important, being an activist and an artist, because artists bring ideas to light. And I feel like that's very important to bring a different perspective. My question is, how would you advise artists to lessen the disparities between being an artist and being a part of being an active and engaged citizen?
Well, let me say, first of all, that you're absolutely right. Great art inspires people's compassion, it inspires their empathy, it helps them get out of our own narrow lives and see a broader world around us, and that all informs our culture and our politics in really powerful ways. So artists have a huge contribution to make in terms of our public life. But maybe if I can broaden the question, because I know we're running out of time, I want to emphasize how impressed I am with all the young people up on this stage. And they're good examples of the young people that I meet every place I go around the world. When I was president, now that I'm no longer president, the generation that's coming up, I think, is as smart, as sophisticated, as tolerant, as thoughtful as any generation that's come before it. And my hope is that that younger generation gets involved, whether you're an artist, a business person, a technician, I don't care what your job is. If we're going to solve the problems that we've discussed here today and take advantage of the opportunities that exist for all of you, people have to be involved. They have to get engaged. I mentioned earlier in the United States the struggle, the long march towards freedom. The people who led the civil rights movement were your age and younger. It wasn't 50-year-olds. It wasn't 70-year-olds. Martin Luther King Jr. had not reached 40 before he was killed. Most of the work he did was in his late 20s and early 30s. Of course, Jesus Christ, was here just for a short period of time, but transformed the world. What you can accomplish at your age, if you are willing to bear that burden of responsibility to be informed, to vote, to be active on your college campuses, to get involved in issues, whether it's climate change or refugees or alleviating poverty or teaching. Those kinds of contributions on a day-to-day basis, as Angela said, you're not going to change the world overnight, but each step that you take, each life that you impact in a positive way, each time you speak out against intolerance, each time you teach a friend about the importance of voting, each time you take a young child and give them encouragement, that's making the world a better place. And that's how artists can make a difference. But if you think you want to be an entrepreneur, or you want to be a pastor, or whatever it is you want to do with your career, getting involved and being engaged is going to be critical for us to solve the problems of today. And being cynical and saying, politicians are all corrupt and institutions are all corrupt and there's nothing I can do. If that's your attitude, then yes, things will get worse. But it'll get worse because you did not make the commitment to live out the values and the things that you believe in most.
Ja, ich wollte von meiner Seite nur sagen, schauen Sie,
from my side, I wanted to say, well,
Sängerin.
You're a singer, which, for example, is something that I am not at all able to do.
Ich finde das wunderbar.
I think it's a wonderful gift.
Der Herrgott uns so geschaffen hat, dass wir unterschiedliche Dinge
God created us different.
Und wenn Sie singen, wenn Sie das machen, was Sie am besten können,
so if you sing, if you do what you know best, then you're already helping others to be encouraged to do something that they can do best. So I think that's a very great contribution to
die Welt wahrnehmen und das natürlich in
the world
ihre
at large
Lieder auch einfließt.
because you're seeing the world as it is, and that is a reflection in your songs, and that makes life more beautiful for others. So it's great that we're made so differently, because we can make politics, others can draw, you can sing. Otherwise, our world would not be diverse and would not be vibrant. So be proud of your gift.
Ja, bevor noch Zeit für eine Schlussfrage an Sie beide ist, möchte ich einfach herzlich Danke sagen für diese wirklich spannenden und herausfordernden und interessanten Fragen. Danke den jungen Leuten. Danke.
Thank you so much for your contribution.
Ja, dann möchte ich zunächst mal Sie, Frau Bundeskanzlerin,
Chancellor
fragen.
Merkel, I'd like to ask you.
Landesbischof von Bayern auch. Da gibt es immer den Starkbieranstich auf dem Nockerberg.
So we always have this
Und da
ritual
werden
on
Politiker
the Nocker
parodiert.
Mountain, and we always, make fun of politicians. It's an annual ritual. And several years ago, you and Mr. Gabriel,
da wurde erstmal die bayerische genüssliche
you have been
Lebensart
criticized, made fun of. We're
und
talking
dann
about your
mussten
way
sie
of
singen,
living, how you
wir wären
indulge
so
and
gern
enjoy life. And
hinterwäldlerisch
then
modern, aber
you
nein,
were described by
wir
saying,
müssen
well, you'd love
evangelisch
to be,
sein. Fühlen Sie
like
sich da
peasants, but then you have to be
wiedergegeben?
evangelical. Do you think this is a fair portrayal of yourself?
Also ich habe mich auf dem Nockerberg schon manchmal
I
zutreffend
quite often
wiedergegeben
found
gefühlt, aber
that
mit dem Lied fühle ich
the
mich
description on the
überhaupt
Nockerberg
nicht
were
zutreffend
very appropriate, but this
wiedergegeben, aber das können
this
nur
song I don't think is all that
diejenigen, die
appropriate, but
vielleicht
only those
katholisch sind, sollten mal
perhaps
nach
can
Franken
sing this
gehen.
who are
In Franken
in the
ist völlig
majority
klar,
Catholic.
man
If you,
darf, man
perhaps
kann
you ought to go to
evangelisch sein und
Franconia.
fröhlich
In
sein und
Franconia,
muss
it's
nicht
absolutely clear that you
gezwungen
are
werden,
allowed to be
genauso wie wir uns
evangelical,
freuen,
are
dass
allowed to be
andere
Protestant,
katholisch
are allowed to be
sind. Das
happy,
macht Deutschland aus,
even in
das
the midst
macht
of
die
so many
Ökumene
Catholics,
aus.
as
Ich
Catholics can
vermute,
be as
Luther, wenn
well.
er die
So I
katholische
think
Kirche
that's
heute gesehen
what,
hätte,
after all,
würde sich
makes the
auch
vibrancy
für
of this
Ökumene
church. And I think if
aussprechen.
Luther today saw this, he would also be a strong proponent of the ecumenical movement.
Herr Präsident,
Mr. President,
es gibt in den
now
USA
in the
eine
US,
Late-Night-Show
there's a late night show
mit Stephen Colbert.
Stephen
Die
Colbert.
Amerikaner kennen diese
All
satirische
Americans know
Late-Night-Show.
this late night show.
Und da haben
It's
Sie
cynical. And you
vor einiger Zeit,
went-
und manche hier in Deutschland haben das
There is
unterziehen müssen.
this
Sie sind
application
in die Late-Night-Show
phase you had to
gegangen
undergo
und Stephen
because you
Colbert hat
went to this
verschiedene
late night show, and Stephen
Fähigkeiten
Colbert,
bei Ihnen abgefragt
well, it was
und Sie
testing
haben
your
darauf
skills,
antworten müssen,
a
zu
skill
sehen,
set, and
wofür
you had
sind
to
Sie qualifiziert.
answer the questions to see
Und Sie haben
what you
dann
actually
noch gesagt,
qualified for, and then
es
you
ist eben auch
said,
nicht ganz einfach, wenn
you
jetzt die
see,
Präsidentschaft
it's
zu
not
Ende
really
geht, mit
easy after
55 noch einen neuen Job zu
presidency is
kriegen.
over to find a job at the age of
Mich
55.
interessiert
You said it was quite
einfach, haben Sie im
hard.
Moment irgendeine
This is one of
Bewerbung
your
laufen?
answers. My own question is, are you actually applying for something right now as it is?
Well, I mean, you let me know if you see something that you think is
I
suitable.
will, I definitely will.
But in the meantime, one of the things that I'm going to be focusing on is my presidential center and foundation. And that's really going to be, I think, my focus over the next several years, trying to create a network so that we can train the next generation of leaders, and that I can help young people like this who are already doing amazing things to get to know each other across countries, within countries, to give them the skills and the tools so that they can make even more changes in the future. I am very optimistic, and the reason I'm most optimistic is because of remarkable young people like this and young people in the audience who are already making the world a better place. My job is to see if I can be a good coach to them so that they can be the next groundbreakers who transform this place into what I think God intended, a place of peace and prosperity, and a place where all our children have opportunity. So, in addition to that, I have to continue being a good husband to Michelle. And that's a full-time job.
Ja.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Mehr bleibt.
Vielen Dank, Barack Obama und Angela Merkel.
Thank you so much, Mr. Barack Obama, Angela Merkel.
Stunden hier verbracht.
We've had
Mehr bleibt die
exciting 90
undankbare
minutes.
Aufgabe zu sagen, jetzt
Now
ist
it's
Schluss.
left up to
Und
me
die
to say
dankbare
now
Aufgabe noch einmal
time has come
ganz
to an
herzlichen
end.
Dank
And
zu
again,
sagen,
thank you so much
Phyllis,
wholeheartedly, Philip, Sierra, Benedict, and Dimani. Thank you so much for your questions, for your commitment. And of course, Chancellor Merkel, thank you so much for having joined us, Mr. Barack Obama, President. Thank you so much for joining us today.